You walk through the corridors of Hampton Court. The air smells of wax and cold stone. Light filters through high windows, cutting pale lines across the floor. The tapestries move just slightly in the draught, but the silence is still too loud. There are no children here, no small feet running through the gallery, no nursemaids, no toys left scattered in corners, only portraits, hung too high, painted too grand, and some of the faces you don't recognise. The famous ones are missing. This is not the world of Elizabeth with her flaming red hair and glittering court. Not Edward, the golden prince who died too soon. Not even Mary remembered for the fires. This is the world of the ones who never grew old. The ones whose names were written once in court records, then quietly scratched out. In one corner of the palace is a nursery room that hasn't been used in years. The crib is gone. The canopied bed stands empty. Only a painted ceiling remains, stars and vines curling above where a baby once lay. If you press your hand to the stone, it still holds the chill. The walls remember what people try to forget. Henry VIII had many children. Most people only know 3, but there were more, and some of them may have been murdered. Not with swords or poison, not always. Some were erased more gently, by silence, by shame, by the quiet hand of power doing what it always does when history becomes inconvenient. You pause near a fireplace, the embers are dead. It's hard to imagine this room warm. Yet once, a boy died just after leaving it. A prince whose birth was celebrated with trumpets and prayers, and whose funeral was smaller than a minor lord's. No portrait remains. His name was Henry. He lived for 52 days. There were others, stillborn daughters. Infants are buried without a public record. A few may have lived long enough to cry. Their mother wept for them, but England turned its face away. This is not the story of succession or glory. This is the story of the children who died quietly, while men argued over crowns, of girls born in blood and never held, of boys marked as heirs and then forgotten before their bones cooled. This is the story that stands behind the story. The cost of keeping a dynasty alive, paid in the lives of those who never had the chance to rule or even speak. You are in the heart of a palace built for pleasure, turned into a shrine for ghosts. Every wall here once echoed with hope. Now it only listens. Now it only keeps secrets. And if you stay long enough, if you listen closely, you might hear them, the forgotten children, waiting. You see him before the crown, before the wives, before the blood. He's 17. Broad shoulders, golden hair, bright eyes that haven't yet dimmed. The second son of a nervous dynasty, taught Latin by candlelight and trained to joust at dawn. Henry Tudor, still a prince, not yet a king, and not yet aware of how fragile his family's hold on power truly is. His father, Henry VII, took the throne not by blood but by war. A single battle ended the Plantagenets. A few thin lines of inheritance stitched together through marriage propped up the new dynasty. But nothing about it felt solid. Not yet. The crown was still heavy with borrowed weight, and everyone knew it could fall again. When his older brother Arthur died, Henry became the only legitimate son. The Tudor future narrowed to a single pair of hands. Everything rested on him. So when he took the throne in 1509, not long after his 18th birthday, the priority was immediate, a wife, and then a son. Catherine of Aragon was already here, already married once to his brother, already waiting. Their union pleased Spain and kept the alliance intact. Henry, young and full of appetite, saw no problem in marrying her. She was intelligent, noble, and had royal blood going back centuries. More than anything, she could bear children. That was the hope, at least. In a palace like Henry's, every pregnancy became a matter of state. Couriers carried the news across kingdoms. Prayers were read in cathedrals. Foreign ambassadors wrote frantic letters back home. All waited for one thing: a boy. A boy meant continuity. A boy meant strength. A boy meant that the wars that had gutted England in the previous century would stay buried. No more rival claims, no more dynastic disputes. One son would settle it all, but sons didn't come, or if they did, they didn't stay. Catherine gave birth multiple times. The first child, a daughter, was stillborn. Then came a boy, Prince Henry. For a moment the bells rang. There was dancing in the streets, but the infant died within weeks. Then another child, stillborn. Then another boy. He died before he could be christened. Again and again. The cradle was brought out, then put away. Catherine finally gave Henry a daughter who lived, Mary. But Mary wasn't what he needed. In England, no woman had ruled in her own right. The memory of Matilda and the anarchy that followed her claim still haunted the nobility. A daughter was not a solution. She was a placeholder, a risk, an invitation for civil war. Henry remained polite in public, but pressure mounted. He needed a son, not just for pride, not for ego, for survival. The Tudor name had no deep roots, no long-established claim. Everything rested on him, and the longer he went without a male heir, the louder the whispers grew. Some said God was punishing him, that marrying his brother's widow had cursed the union, that Catherine's womb was closed for a reason. Others blamed Catherine's age. Her body had failed him, they said. Her failure was personal, but it carried the weight of national crisis. Henry began to watch the women at court more closely. A gaze that once settled on tournaments and theology now lingered on dresses and necklines. Fertile, young, English, qualities Catherine no longer possessed. What began as dissatisfaction became obsession. He read Leviticus, interpreted the verse that said, "A man should not lie with his brother's wife," as divine warning. Never mind that the Pope had approved the marriage years before. Never mind that Catherine swore her first marriage had not been consummated. Henry heard what he needed to hear. God had denied him a son because he had broken God's law. That's what he told himself. That's what he told his court. That's what he told his people. But beneath the scripture there was fear. Real, gripping fear. A kingdom cannot survive without a future, and a future needs a son. That fear would guide every decision Henry made for the rest of his life. It would cost him 6 wives, countless lives, and a break with the Catholic Church. It would transform a Renaissance prince into a tyrant. But before all that, before the executions and the Reformation and the split from Rome, there was only this: a man staring at an empty cradle, hearing only silence, and the clock ticking. You don't hear their names because history never gave them any. The records speak in fragments, a birth, a death, sometimes only on a date, sometimes not even that. But inside the stone walls of the royal apartments, these children lived for moments, or days, or weeks. They cried, they bled, they were held, baptized, and buried. Then forgotten. Catherine of Aragon was pregnant at least 6 times. The court prepared for each birth with the same pattern: prayers, clean linens, couriers waiting outside the gates. All of England held its breath every time she went into labour. The first child, born in 1510, was a daughter. She lived only a few hours. No name was recorded, no ceremony marked her passing. A tiny coffin was carried out of the palace before dawn. The Queen, still weak from labour, was told to rest. In 1511, a boy was born, Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall. His arrival brought celebration. The bells of London rang, tournaments were declared. Henry rode in full armour to show the world that his son had secured the Tudor legacy. For 52 days, England had its future. Then, the boy died. There was no warning, no fever, no illness anyone could name. He simply slipped away, the way infants sometimes do when medicine fails and mothers are left with nothing but silence. Henry never forgot. For the rest of his life, he would recall that short-lived son as the proof that God once smiled on his marriage, and later as the proof that the blessing had been revoked. After the Duke of Cornwall's death, there were more pregnancies. In 1513, another child was born too early to survive. No name, no record beyond a line in an ambassador's letter. Then in 1514, another brief hope. A son, born living. He died hours later. Catherine was praised for her courage. Henry wrote that he was hopeful, that God would provide. But the optimism thinned. Each miscarriage, each stillbirth, pulled the Tudor dream further into the grave. In 1516, Mary was born. She lived. She breathed. She cried. And the court cheered, because living was better than dying. But beneath the cheers there was disappointment. She was a girl. No one said it out loud. Not at first. But it hung in the air, thick, sour, unspoken. A daughter could marry. A daughter could rule in theory. But a daughter could not stop a civil war if rival claimants rose. A daughter could not promise stability in a country that had only known peace for one generation. In 1518, Catherine gave birth again. A daughter, stillborn. The Queen bled for days. Some thought she wouldn't survive. She did. But part of her never recovered. There may have been more. Pregnancy wasn't always recorded unless it progressed far enough to matter to politics. What was once public knowledge became private pain. By the 1520s, the Queen's fertility was fading. The cradle was stored away. The tapestries changed. And yet none of these children were named in sermons. None were honoured with portraits. Only Mary remained. You can picture the rooms where they died. Richly carved beds, velvet pillows, cold stone beneath their cribs, women moving in and out, carrying bowls of water and bloodied cloth, courtiers waiting for news that never came, a midwife shaking her head, a priest summoned quietly for last rites, then slipping away just as quietly. Henry waited in another room, always in another room. Kings did not attend births. They waited for sons, not screams. And when no son came, he found someone to blame. Catherine, God, the Pope, eventually Anne Boleyn. But the truth was simpler. The Tudor dynasty sat on a knife's edge. It needed life to survive. It got death instead. These lost infants were more than private sorrow. They were political failures. Every miscarriage rippled through the court. Factions shifted. Foreign powers recalculated alliances. Enemies grew bold. The future of England dimmed with each unmarked grave. And so they were buried without ceremony, without memory. They became shadows in royal bloodlines, forgotten not because they were unimportant, but because they mattered too much to acknowledge. You can stand in the chapel at Westminster and look for their names. You won't find them. The stones speak of victories, of queens and kings. Not a few tiny lives ended in silence, but they were there. Their deaths shaped everything. They turned a Renaissance prince into a desperate man. They made a king believe God was punishing him. They turned a country toward revolution, not with armies, but with absence. This is not the story England tells itself, but it's the story underneath. The soft thud of a coffin lid too small for a crown. The rattle of breath that never turned to speech. The rooms that were cleaned before the Queen awoke so she wouldn't see the blood. The lost children of Henry VIII. No names, no portraits, no future, just silence. You see her standing straight, even when no one wants her to. She wears the Tudor red and gold, her mother's Spanish dignity wrapped around her like armour. Mary Tudor, princess by birth, then bastard by law, then queen by sheer force of will. But long before the fires, before the crown, she was just a girl trying to stay still while the walls of her world cracked and shifted. She was born in 1516, the only child of Catherine of Aragon to survive infancy. Her birth was bittersweet. The Queen had lost so much already. The court celebrated politely, but behind closed doors Henry kept counting. One daughter, no sons. Mary was valuable, but not enough. Still, she was loved. Catherine adored her. Henry showed pride in public. Mary's early years were golden. She had her own household, tutors, musicians, foreign envoys visiting with gifts and offers of marriage. Spain wanted her. France considered it. She was a princess, a bargaining chip, a future alliance wrapped in silk and ceremony. But she was also her mother's daughter. That would become her curse. By the time Mary turned 10, her father was already circling Anne Boleyn. He had begun to speak of conscience, of sin, of the need to set things right with God. Catherine would not give him a son. Anne was young, English, and untested. A new start, a new womb, a new chance at immortality. Mary didn't see it that way. She saw her mother weeping in private. She saw friends dismissed, allies removed, courtiers whispering. She saw her name fade from letters and proclamations. She heard her title disappear. No longer Princess Mary, now just the lady. She wasn't allowed to speak to her mother, not even to write. Catherine was sent away, declared an unlawful wife. Mary remained at court, alone. She was ordered to serve in the household of Anne Boleyn's infant daughter, her half-sister Elizabeth. It was deliberate, a punishment dressed as obedience. She refused to call Elizabeth a princess, refused to sign documents that denied her own birthright, refused to name her mother anything but queen. And for this she was watched, harassed, threatened. Her letters were read, her servants were changed. Her health, always fragile, began to fail. She coughed blood, could not stand without dizziness. Some thought she would die. Henry did nothing. Years passed like that. Anne Boleyn fell. Elizabeth was branded illegitimate. But Mary's position did not improve. She was still a threat, still a daughter of a discarded queen, still a symbol of Catholic defiance in a court shifting toward reform. Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane tried to intercede for Mary, urged reconciliation. Henry agreed on one condition. Mary must acknowledge the king's supremacy over the church, must declare herself illegitimate, must betray her mother in writing. Mary resisted, for weeks, then months. Eventually she broke. She signed the document, declared herself no longer royal, no longer her mother's heir, no longer legitimate. The words cut deeper than any punishment, but they brought peace of a kind. Henry allowed her back to court, gave her dresses, a place at feasts, even words of kindness. But the damage had been done. Mary learned the lesson. Survival required silence, obedience, endurance, and memory. She never forgot. Not the separation, not the shame, not the long hours of cold rooms and colder letters. She wore her trauma like iron beneath her silk. It gave her shape. It gave her an edge. This is the shadow Mary grew under. Not just the disappointment of being a girl, but the violence of being discarded. Her very existence had been rewritten by power. Her childhood wasn't lost to time. It was taken, pulled apart by politics and pride. When she became queen, she ruled with the certainty of someone who had already seen what happens when you hesitate, when you bend, when you wait for mercy that never comes. But that came later. Before all that, she was just a child standing at the edge of her father's ambition, watching her name vanish. Her mother vanished, her safety vanished, and learning quietly how to live without them. He was the son Henry VIII never should have had, and the one he allowed himself to hope for. Henry Fitzroy was born in 1519, not to Catherine of Aragon, but to Elizabeth Blount, one of the Queen's maids of honour. The affair was quiet, carefully managed. The child, less so. When Fitzroy was born, the king did something no English monarch had done in generations. He acknowledged a bastard, not in whispers, not with hush money or private gifts. He made him visible. Fitzroy was given the surname traditionally used for royal illegitimate children. Fitzroy, son of the king. But that wasn't all. Henry gave him titles, wealth, a household. By the age of 6, Fitzroy was Duke of Richmond and Somerset, Lord High Admiral and Warden of the Marches. He had 2 castles, dozens of tutors, and more servants than most earls. He was being raised like a prince, treated like an heir. Some at court whispered the obvious. The king had no legitimate son. He had no hope of one from Catherine. If Fitzroy was strong, if he grew into a man the nobles could respect, perhaps he could be legitimised. It had been done before. The Plantagenets had done it. The French had done it. And if the Pope agreed, Fitzroy could be the next king. But it never reached that point. Fitzroy grew tall, slender, and serious. His portraits show a boy with delicate features, a pale face, and downcast eyes. He wore crimson robes edged in gold, and carried himself with quiet dignity. But beneath the fine clothes, his body betrayed him. At 17, he was already showing signs of illness. Some said tuberculosis. Others claimed sweating sickness. The records aren't clear. What is clear is this: he was dying. In the summer of 1536, just weeks after Anne Boleyn's execution, Fitzroy collapsed. He was staying at St James's Palace. His health had been fading for months, but this time it didn't recover. He couldn't eat, he couldn't stand. His breath came in ragged bursts. He died quietly. There was no state funeral, no grand procession. His burial was private, away from the public eye. The king did not attend. Henry never spoke of Fitzroy again. But his death mattered. In the weeks before Fitzroy's illness worsened, Parliament had passed a law allowing the king to name any heir he chose, legitimate or not. It was designed for moments exactly like this. Henry could have named Fitzroy, could have set a precedent that would have changed everything. He never did. Whether it was hesitation, fear of papal backlash, or a final refusal to elevate a bastard, we don't know. But the opportunity closed. Fitzroy's death sealed it. In that quiet corner of a royal history, the what-ifs stack like stones. What if Fitzroy had lived? Would Henry have legitimised him? Would he have ruled instead of Edward? Would the Reformation have followed the same path? Would Mary or Elizabeth ever have been crowned? None of it happened. Instead, Fitzroy's memory faded. His name slipped from the lists of heirs and pretenders. His face vanished from coins. His brief place in the line of succession became a footnote. But the experiment left its mark. Fitzroy's life proved how far Henry would go for a son. Even a son born outside marriage. Even a son born of a passing affair. He built a world around him, a court, a future, a path to power, only to watch it collapse when the boy's body failed. And in that collapse, something changed in the king. Fitzroy was the last time Henry allowed himself to hope without caution. After that, the decisions became sharper. The stakes are clearer. Anne Boleyn's rise, Catherine's fall, the break with Rome. All of it followed the same line: the need for a son and the cost of not having one. Fitzroy never wore a crown, but for a few short years he was closer to one than anyone else. He was the son Henry had made with ease, the one he could see, touch, raise, and then bury. The only thing more dangerous than having no heir is believing you found one, only to lose him before the crown is ready. That loss doesn't just create grief, it creates panic, and panic shapes kingdoms. She promised him sons. That's how it began. Anne Boleyn didn't seduce the king with beauty. She wasn't the most graceful or most charming woman at court, but she had something different. She knew how to speak to power without bowing. She knew how to offer a future, not just a body. And Henry listened. He tore England apart to have her, pulled his kingdom out of Rome's orbit, called himself head of the church, declared Catherine of Aragon's marriage invalid, declared Mary illegitimate, all for Anne, all for the promise of sons. She gave him one daughter, Elizabeth. Then she gave him hope. 2 more pregnancies followed. Both ended in silence. One miscarriage came in 1534. The child was lost early. No sex was recorded, no name. The Queen was shaken but not defeated. She still believed. So did Henry. He still called her his rightful wife, still gave her honours, still waiting. Then came January 1536. Anne was pregnant again. The court held its breath. This time she told Henry it was a boy. She swore it. Her doctors believed it. The Queen began to prepare for a royal birth. A son would silence the critics. A son would secure her crown. A son would make her the mother of the next King of England. But the boy never came. Anne miscarried in the second trimester. The fetus was male, likely formed enough to be recognised. The Queen collapsed. She'd been told bad news that morning. Henry had fallen from his horse in a joust, knocked unconscious. Some say it was the shock that caused the miscarriage. Others say it was stress, too much pressure, too much fear. When she lost that child, she lost everything. Henry didn't rage. He went quiet, cold. The same man who had defied Rome for her now avoided her rooms. The same man who had written love letters in Latin now sent messages through advisors. Something in him broke, or shifted. Anne knew it. She wrote letters, begged for meetings, appealed to his faith, to his memory, to his ambition. But her enemies had already begun to circle. The miscarriage gave them what they needed. She had failed to deliver. The court no longer believed she could. She was arrested in May, charged with adultery, incest and treason. Her trial was public, her fall humiliating. The same nobles who had toasted her rise now swore she had betrayed the king. Witnesses were coached, evidence fabricated. The outcome was decided before the first question was asked. Anne was executed at the Tower. Her head was taken by sword. Her body is buried in an unmarked grave, but her sons had died before she did. That was the true reason for her fall. Not her words, not her flirtations, not even her enemies. She failed to give Henry what he had ripped the world apart to get. A boy. When they closed her apartments, they found children's clothes packed away, linen trimmed in gold, swaddling bands embroidered with Tudor roses. The items had been prepared for a prince. They were never used. No official record names her sons. Only quiet notes from ambassadors, midwives and courtiers. They speak of pregnancies ending early, of blood, of the Queen's tears, of the King's disappointment. Anne Boleyn wasn't executed for treason. She was executed for failing the future. In a kingdom ruled by men, a queen's power came from the womb. Anne's womb had emptied itself of hope, and so they emptied her place in history. But the irony never left Henry. The daughter she gave him, Elizabeth, would one day rule longer than any Tudor. She would never marry, never give birth. But she would carry the crown more steadily than any man who came before her. Anne Boleyn's sons never drew breath, but her daughter reshaped the kingdom. That came later. In Anne's time, all that mattered was what was missing. A child, a male heir, a reason to keep her alive. Without one, she became a mistake to erase. And so she was. She came quietly. Jane Seymour didn't argue, didn't tease, didn't promise revolutions. She didn't write letters in French or keep the king waiting outside her door. She lowered her eyes, said little, and wore pale colours. After Anne Boleyn, that was enough. Henry called her pure, called her peace. He married her 11 days after Anne's execution. The court changed its tone. Music grew softer. Courtiers watched their steps. The Queen spoke gently, asked for mercy for Mary, and kept her distance from politics. But she knew what was expected of her. She didn't need to be told. Her job was to give the king a son. For over 2 years, she didn't. Henry began to age in those years. His leg ulcer worsened, his moods darkened, but Jane remained in favour. She gave no cause for anger. She remained obedient, present, and, most importantly, pregnant by early 1537. The court exhaled. This time, it would be different. This time, the child would live. Jane was of good stock. Her family had not challenged the king, her body untouched by scandal. She was, in Henry's eyes, what a queen should be: silent, fertile, English. The preparations for the birth lasted months. Jane's chambers were sealed. Only women were allowed inside: midwives, physicians, noblewomen, servants. A full court waited outside the doors. The pressure was enormous. The Queen was not only delivering a child, she was delivering stability. On October 12th, 1537, Jane gave birth to a boy, Edward. Guns fired in celebration. Bells rang across London. Bonfires were lit in the countryside. The Tudor line, for the first time in 2 decades, had a legitimate male heir. Henry wept. He had a son, a living, breathing son. But Jane was fading. She'd been in labour for 2 days and nights, exhausted, torn, likely infected. She smiled for the christening. She posed for a portrait. But within days she grew pale and fevered. The doctors could do nothing. 12 days after giving Henry the heir he wanted more than anything in the world, she died. The king buried her with honours. She was the only one of his 6 wives buried beside him. The only one he called his true wife. The only one who gave him what he wanted. But the victory was thin. Edward was sickly from the start. Pale, small, prone to coughing fits. He was watched closely, protected fiercely. His every breath was measured, his every movement tracked. He became a symbol, not a child. The court that had once revolved around Henry now turned toward Edward's crib. Noble factions formed around him. Ambassadors recalculated alliances. His existence calmed the country and made it more dangerous. Because if he died, there would be nothing left. Henry never remarried for love again. The urgency of a male heir had passed. He tried once more, Anne of Cleves for political reasons. Then again, Catherine Howard for youth. Then once more, Catherine Parr for care. But none of them gave him children. Edward was it, the fragile thread that held the Tudor future. Jane Seymour's legacy was simple. She did not rule, she did not advise, she did not fall from favour. She gave birth to a boy and died, and that was enough to make her a success in Henry's eyes. But it was a narrow kind of success. She had no time to raise her son, no chance to shape his reign. Her image was carefully preserved as the good queen, the perfect wife, the silent mother. Her tragedy became her praise. But behind the portraits and poems, her life tells a simpler truth. To be Queen of England was not to be safe. Even if you did everything right, even if you gave the king exactly what he asked for. Jane Seymour survived the court, the rivalries, the politics, but not the birth. And in her absence, a boy was raised to bear the weight of a country that had killed his mother just by needing him. She was 15 when the king noticed her. Catherine Howard came from a noble family, but not a powerful one. She had no lands, no strong alliances. What she had was youth. She laughed easily, danced well, and moved like someone who had never seen a battlefield or a birthing chamber. After Jane Seymour's quiet sorrow, Catherine was light, and Henry wanted light. By the time they married, he was nearly 50, obese. His leg oozed infection. He walked with difficulty. He hid behind silks and jewels and pageants. Catherine stood beside him like spring beside winter. The court called her the rose without a thorn. Henry called her his rose. He showered her with gifts, jewels, gowns, a household of her own. But what he wanted still was the thing he had chased through 5 marriages, a son. Catherine never gave him one. Whether she was ever pregnant, we don't know. No record mentions a miscarriage or a stillbirth, but she had barely turned 16. Her body might not have been ready. Or maybe she did conceive and lost the child in private. In a court like Henry's, even silence could be orchestrated. But the king waited, watched, and while he watched, the rumours began. They said she had lovers before the king, that she'd shared beds with music tutors, young courtiers, and household servants. Then came the real danger. Rumours that one of them had returned, that one of them had followed her into her queenship, that she hadn't stopped. In another court with another king, it might have been brushed away. But Henry was tired, suspicious, hardened by betrayal. He had executed one wife already. He would not hesitate again. Catherine was arrested in 1541. The investigation was brutal. Her old love letters were found. Her servants were interrogated. Some were tortured. One of her former lovers confessed. Another was beheaded before her trial even began. She confessed to nothing at first. Then she broke. She was young, alone, surrounded by men who called her whore, traitor, and liar. She was 17 when she died. The axe fell fast. Her body was buried near Anne Boleyn's, the same graveyard, the same crown, the same end. Catherine Howard never had a child, never had the chance. But her story fits among the others because it shows what waited for women who failed to deliver one. Even without miscarriage, even without birth, the expectation was there. Silent, heavy, inescapable. She was not executed for adultery. She was executed for the possibility that another man might father the heir Henry still believed he deserved. Youth didn't protect her. Beauty didn't save her. She came to court untouched by scandal and left it without a head. Catherine Howard's crime was not being barren. Her crime was being young in a world that demanded women mature on schedule, obey without falter, and bear sons on command. She danced her way into history, and then bled out of it. Not with children, but with silence. She wasn't chosen for her youth. She wasn't chosen for beauty. Catherine Parr became Henry's sixth wife because she was safe, educated, Protestant, twice widowed, no scandals, no enemies. She read Latin, wrote prayers, managed households. She understood pain, understood power, and knew how to move through court without leaving footprints. By the time she married Henry in 1543, the king was near the end. His leg was always open, always draining. He could barely climb stairs. He wore layers of fur and gold to hide the decline. The old pride remained, but the body had given out. What he needed was care. What he needed was loyalty. Catherine gave him both. She became more than a wife. She became nurse, secretary, and companion. She read with him, argued about theology, acted as regent when he went to war, and she survived. She survived him. But in their marriage, one expectation lingered, barely spoken, but present in every glance. She had not yet had children, and Henry, though aging and sick, still believed he could father more. Edward was alive but weak. The dynasty was secure on paper, not in reality. A pregnancy would have sealed her place. It never came. There are no records of a miscarriage, no notes from midwives, no signs that she was ever with child during her marriage to the king. Perhaps she was barren. Perhaps she chose caution. Perhaps she understood that bearing Henry another child could mean stepping into the same grave as Jane Seymour. The court didn't press her, not openly. She was respected, useful. But without a child, she remained slightly outside the circle of security. Her position was strong but not unshakable. Henry died in 1547. Catherine was widowed for the third time. She wore black, accepted condolences, and then, quietly, she remarried. Not to a nobleman or a statesman, to Thomas Seymour, younger, handsome, ambitious. It caused a scandal. Catherine was barely out of mourning. Seymour was the uncle of the new king. But the two had courted before Henry's proposal, and now that the crown was no longer in the way, they acted fast. And soon she was pregnant. The child Henry never gave her now grew under another man's name. She was nearly 35, older than most women at court when they carried their first. But she wrote letters full of hope. She believed the child would bring peace, closure. She moved to Sudeley Castle for the birth. In August 1548, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour. 6 days later, Catherine was dead. Puerperal fever, infection, blood poisoning. The same fate that had taken Jane Seymour and so many others before her. Her body, worn down by years of duty and politics, could not survive the final test. The daughter lived, for a time, but after Thomas Seymour was executed for treason, no one wanted the girl. She was passed from one household to another, then the records stop. Mary Seymour disappears from history. No grave, no marriage, no legacy, just absence. Catherine Parr had no surviving children, no dynasty, but she held the line. She held the king. She brought Mary and Elizabeth back into favour. She kept Edward steady in his early years. She managed to guide 3 heirs without giving birth to one. But the one child she did bear, the child she might have raised in peace, vanished like the others. The last wife, the last child, and the quiet end of a woman who spent her whole life tending to other people's futures. Some heirs don't wear crowns, some never make it to birth. Others are erased before the ink dries on their names. Not all of Henry VIII's children came from queens. Not all were born in palaces or cradled in state. Some were rumours, whispers passed between courtiers, scrawled in foreign dispatches, left out of official histories. But in a reign defined by succession, even a rumour could be dangerous. There were stories that Elizabeth Blount bore more than one child by the king, that other women, maids, ladies-in-waiting, even commoners, carried his children in secret. Names like Mary Berkeley, Joanna Dingley, and Anne Bassett appear in ambassadorial letters, always paired with suspicion, never proof. None of these children were publicly acknowledged. None received titles like Henry Fitzroy. But some may have been born, and some may have died quietly. The court was a machine designed to produce heirs. Every pregnancy had implications. A bastard with royal blood could become a threat, especially if the king's legitimate line remained fragile. It didn't take much. A boy with the right look, a girl with the wrong timing. One indiscretion, one slip, and a noble family could rise or fall. Some bastards were used briefly. Henry Carey, son of Mary Boleyn, looked enough like the king to raise eyebrows. He was never officially claimed, but he received royal favour, titles, wealth, protection, enough to make people wonder, enough to keep them quiet. Others vanished. There were quiet arrangements. A girl removed from court, a child placed in the country, money exchanged, names changed. The goal was to protect the king from embarrassment, or protect the child from becoming a liability. No bastards were legitimised after Fitzroy. After his death, the door closed. Henry focused all attention on Edward. The idea of another illegitimate heir was no longer useful. It was dangerous. But that didn't stop the rumours. One tale claimed that a maid gave birth to a son in the palace, and that the child was sent away within hours. Another said a noblewoman confessed on her deathbed that the king had fathered her firstborn. The stories pile up, none confirmed, none entirely disproven. In a court ruled by secrecy and fear, truth didn't always survive. There were also the threats Henry believed existed, whether they did or not. Boys who bore resemblance to the Tudor line, girls with suspicious colouring, a young man found in the household of a rival. Sometimes they were just coincidences. Sometimes they were coincidences that couldn't be allowed. A few simply disappeared. In times of uncertainty, a child didn't need to be real to be dangerous. He just needed to be believed. Factions could rally around a shadow. Plots could begin with a rumour. And in Henry's mind, every possible heir not under his control was a threat to his power. So the net was cast wide, and the names that were never spoken in Parliament were sometimes the ones most feared behind palace doors. You won't find them in genealogies, not officially. But their presence was felt. Every time Henry made a law redefining succession, every time he demanded oaths of loyalty, Every time he searched a servant's quarters or questioned a noble's guest list, they were the invisible heirs, not because they never existed, but because they were never allowed to matter. Some may have lived. Most, if real, didn't live long. All were erased. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important to be left alive. Their names are missing from the records because they never got far enough to matter. Not to the law, not to succession, but they mattered to the women who carried them. Each queen who died without producing a living heir left behind more than a vacant title. She left behind the shadow of a child that never arrived. Catherine of Aragon's lost sons were buried quietly without fanfare. One lived long enough to be christened. The rest were swept into silence, sealed inside wombs that failed under the weight of royal expectation. Their mother wept alone while the court moved on. Anne Boleyn gave England a queen in Elizabeth, but before her, between her, were the miscarried bodies that never made it to cradle or crown. One, a boy, was lost in early 1536. Henry never forgave her. The court didn't have to say it aloud. Everyone understood. The king's love ended with the promise of a dead heir. Jane Seymour bore a son and died days later. Her body had done its duty, but had she lived, had she carried again, there may have been more. Edward might not have stood alone, sickly and watched like a relic. But Jane was gone before another chance came. Catherine Howard, too young to be called a mother, was never given the space to become one. If she conceived, no one said. Her body was treated as a scandal, not sanctuary. Her value ended the moment suspicion began. Catherine Parr tried. Not with Henry, but with another man. The child survived. She didn't. Her daughter faded into history with no known death, no known grave. Each queen left behind what might have been. Not all loss is seen. Some are measured in what never came to be, in the royal nurseries that were never filled, in swaddling clothes stored in cabinets for children who never arrived, in pages of midwives' journals that recorded nothing but silence. The children of the dead queens lived only long enough to be mourned in private. Their absence changed the line of succession, changed Henry, changed the court. But history left them out. They didn't die as traitors. They didn't die as rulers. They died as possibilities. In a palace where bloodlines were everything, their blood was never given the chance to matter. Their mothers were remembered in time through portraits and sermons and lessons taught in schools. But the children, they are not part of England's story because they didn't make it into the story. Their deaths were not recorded in great books. Their lives were not etched into stone. Yet they were there, in the Queen's chambers, in the quiet prayers, in the doctor's lowered eyes. They were always there, and they were gone before they could even be named. In Henry VIII's England, a baby wasn't just a child. It was a message, a living declaration of power, stability, and control. And when that baby was male, the message became a weapon. The kingdom had only known peace for a generation. The Tudors were new blood. Their hold on the crown still carried the echo of civil war. Henry knew this. His council knew this. Europe watched for it. One dead infant could shift alliances. One healthy son could silence rebellion. Every time a queen became pregnant, the court changed. Factions rose and fell depending on who they thought would gain power. The Seymours held their breath during Jane's pregnancy. The Howards held it during Anne Boleyn's. The Queen's belly became a battlefield. The child inside, a potential prize. When Elizabeth was born, disappointment echoed through the palace, not because she was weak or unwanted, but because she wasn't a boy. A daughter couldn't stop a war. A daughter couldn't lead an army. A daughter couldn't guarantee the throne would stay in Tudor hands. Not yet. So the court recalculated. So did Henry. He had married Anne for a son. Now he had only more uncertainty, more whispers, more need to try again. The death of a child wasn't just a personal grief. It was a political collapse. When Henry Fitzroy died, Nobles who had quietly supported his potential claim had to shift their loyalties. Those who feared his legitimacy suddenly felt safer. One boy's illness reshaped entire networks of influence. Even unborn children held power. Anne Boleyn's final pregnancy changed the tone of her trial. Some say her miscarriage, the male fetus lost at around 15 weeks, was the moment Henry decided she was no longer useful. If she could no longer produce sons, she was no longer a queen. And queens who lost power didn't retire. They fell. Every womb in Henry's court was watched, counted, measured. A queen who didn't conceive quickly enough became suspicious. A woman who conceived outside of marriage became a threat. A child rumoured to carry royal blood, even without proof, could be used as a tool, or seen as a danger to be removed. There were no neutral births, no private losses. Even Mary's childhood was shaped by this. She'd been born a princess, declared legitimate, and courted by Europe. But once her mother's position changed, her own status fell. Her birth was no longer a source of pride. It became an error to erase, a political inconvenience that had to be rewritten. Henry made laws to control succession, but even those shifted depending on what was happening in a queen's chambers. One act of parliament would favour Mary, another would erase her. A new child's arrival could undo years of policy overnight. The dynastic war wasn't fought with swords in those years. It was fought in silence, in miscarriages and midwives' whispers, in prayers offered at dawn and in physicians summoned too late. Power passed through blood. But it started in the cradle, or didn't. That's what made it terrifying. An infant could command the future before learning to speak. A fetus could determine the fate of a nation. A stillbirth could tilt a kingdom off balance, and no one could control it, not even the king. The trumpets sounded over Westminster. Gold banners waved in the wind. Nobles stood in rows, velvet heavy, eyes fixed on the boy moving toward the throne. Edward VI was 9 years old. He walked with careful steps. His robes were too large. His crown had to be adjusted. The orb in his hand looked heavier than his frame could bear. But he smiled. He bowed. He recited the oaths. The archbishop anointed him with holy oil. The people cheered. They called it a triumph, a new age, the Protestant king. The promise was fulfilled. But behind the veil there were shadows. They didn't stand in the abbey. They didn't kneel. They didn't speak. But they were there. The boy's mother, Jane Seymour, who died days after giving birth to him, left him not just a crown, but a coffin. Her voice was missing from the ceremony. Her hand wasn't there to hold his sleeve. Her presence was folded into the silence of duty fulfilled. His half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, stood apart. Both had been declared illegitimate. Both had watched their mothers fall. They smiled for the crowd, but their faces stayed unreadable. And then there were the others, the ones not listed on the rolls, the ones never painted, the ones never named, the brothers who died before birth, the sisters who lived for hours, the sons lost to fever, the daughters lost time, the line of Tudor infants who were meant to stand here but didn't. Their absence held weight. Henry VIII's obsession with an heir built this moment. 6 marriages, 2 dead queens, 1 severed church, all of it for this child, this slim, pale boy now wearing the crown. A crown soaked in so much expectation that it didn't rest on his head. It pressed. Edward had no brothers, no cousins near his age, no royal uncles, just ghosts. When he was lifted onto the throne, the crowd roared, but the palace knew better. He was a symbol more than a sovereign, a placeholder more than a king, a boy raised on rules and sermons, watched from every angle, shaped by men who waited for him to fail or die. He ruled for 6 years, long enough to change laws, long enough to fear death, long enough to realize that no one truly ruled alone. But at the coronation, all of that was still ahead. On that cold January day in 1547, Edward sat on the throne his father built with marriages and executions, prayers and punishments. The sun hit the stained glass, incense curled through the air. And in the quiet corners of the abbey, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear them, the children who came before him, whose hearts never beat long enough, whose lives were gambled for power, whose names were never spoken,